I'd like to open the floor to the panelists and give them a moment, a minute or two, to summarize some of their thoughts on this topic. I know it's very broad and large, but perhaps a little synopsis before we get to the prepared questions. And I'm just going to randomly select Erica to lead the discussion.
Thank you for having me here. I'm really excited. My first thought was that I didn't know how much I was going to have to say on the topic. But then as, I sat and reflected and realized that actually, I guess what we do is respond to emergencies on a fairly regular basis in the last couple of years. So the Ottawa Community Food Partnership was created in the community to act as a way to bring agencies together and help everybody start pulling in the same direction with responses to the larger emergency of poverty creating food scarcity in the community. It's not scarcity, but people not having enough food. But, along the way, we also have all of these acute emergencies, like the ones Michelle mentioned, that we are being asked to respond to. And I think one of the reasons that the Ottawa Community Food Partnership is well positioned to respond to some of those emergencies is because of how many different groups and people and agencies and businesses that we are working with at all times. So really building those community connections and having those relationships when emergencies happen goes a long way to being able to respond quickly. Like if you take the example of the storm in May, within a day, we were able to talk to our restaurant business partners and have them start producing meals and getting them out to people that are without power, on a fairly quick turnaround. I mean, the concern with what happened in May was that there didn't seem to be a plan from a government level of how the emergency response was going to be funded, and that's very concerning. And we definitely identified some gaps in our ability to communicate with people on a long weekend and things of that nature. But having those relationships in place really does go a long way to help with the emergency response. And I mean, that was true with the pandemic, and again, true with the trucker occupation earlier in the year.
Great. Thank you, Erica. That's some great insight there. We'll pass it to Christine, who can maybe do the same thing, a little brief synopsis.
Would it be okay if I shared my screen? I have a presentation. Would that be okay?
This is just kind of a bit of an opener. If you can do it in under 2 minutes.
I absolutely can.
Okay, let's. I don't know if you have the permission to do that. If you can, go ahead. And if not, we'll just circulate it. Maybe just identify a couple highlights from that. We can circulate that to participants thereafter.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So my name is Christine Taylor. I've worked in emergency management, as you said, with Ottawa Public Health. And as Erica said, as a city, we've experienced some emergencies, and our city has experienced one extreme weather event per year and two in 2019, power outages, extreme weather, wind. And in 2022, we had the truck convoy that disrupted our community for almost a month. And then finally, that life-changing event, which was COVID-19, the pandemic. So these emergencies and the responses present an opportunity for us to revisit how we deal with emergencies and emergency preparedness, community resilience that both impact community and food security. So like Ottawa is a really big city. I don't know if everybody understands or realizes that you can fit like Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver inside our city. So the boundaries are really big. And so knowing the risks in your community and the local context is super important, because what's a risk or a hazard, let's say in Constance Bay wouldn't be a risk or a hazard downtown Ottawa, right? It just does, it's not the same. And living in a high rise versus, a townhouse presents very different challenges as it relates to food security and water. And so my message today is emergency preparedness. We need to consider our basic needs. So it would be food, shelter, social connection, and water, sorry. And so I'm going to be presenting that. And then lastly, I think what we need to do is that everyone needs to be involved in emergency preparedness by sharing and learning together. And
that's great, Christine. Well, there's
okay.
lots of questions. You can kind of plug your points in as we move along here. I'm just going to pass it on to Rahul. Great synopsis, Christine. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Rahul, if you just want to spend a minute or two doing the same kind of thing, and then we'll move on to the questions, and we'll have an opportunity to get our points out throughout the question period. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so Global Medic's a Canadian NGO. We're an international disaster response agency. We've run 250 ops, worked in 81 countries. While I'm talking to you, I have teams in Pakistan, in Ukraine, the surrounding countries by Ukraine, Tonga, St. Vincent, working in the war in Syria, Yemen, Lebanon. Like we're all over the world. We run a number of domestic food security programs. Point I'll say to you is needs have increased. Needs are incredibly high right now. The money to meet those needs is not there. We need to innovate to do more to lower the cost of transaction in order to get people the aid they need. And the first responders in crisis are always the local community. Was that quick enough?
That was great. Thank you so much. And I like how we're talking about local and community, because I agree that what impacts folks, in another part of the country or the city might not be the reality for folks living in different parts. So I like that community tie in there, really valuable piece. So we have some preset questions that we're going to get through. Again, about 2 minutes per panelist to answer the question, and then we'll mobilize to get some questions directly from the chat. All right. So the first question is, how do you define an emergency? And speaking to the different types of emergencies, some of them that we've already covered. So we'll start this time. We'll go ahead and start with Christine.
So an emergency is sorry, I'm just going to pull up my notes. It results when a hazard interacts with a vulnerability to produce a serious and adverse consequence. It's an undetermined amount of time, and it exceeds one's ability to cope, or a community's ability to cope. That is the definition of an emergency. And so we've seen that multiple emergencies throughout Ottawa, and ability to cope could be the mental health impacts, like we saw with the convoy. It could be the ability to cope when water's rushing in and Constance Bay, or it could be one's ability to cope, while they're in a high rise with no water and no power. I'm not in a war-torn country like Raul, like in those war-torn countries, but it's an inability to cope.
Agreed. Thank you. Thank you. Raul, do you want to go ahead and also provide an answer to the question?
Yeah, and emergencies whenever your local system is overwhelmed, right? So whether it's that 45-second earthquake in Haiti that wipes out 145% of the GDP, kills 300,000 and leaves 1.3 million homeless, or if it's this ugly war in Ukraine where you've got swarms of drones coming down and hitting civilians, right? It's a system that's overwhelmed and it needs additional response. And then we tend to work on the supply side of getting the right aid to the right people at the right time. So that's the definition of an emergency. Really quickly, you draw a triangle, and this is how we determine if we're responding. At the top end of the triangle is there a need? Is there a quantified need? Just like I described for Haiti, obviously there was a need. Bottom left of the triangle, access. Can we get in? Is it North Korea? Is there the ability to come in? If it's Ukraine, do we come in from one of the borders? Because obviously we can't fly in. And then funding, right? Do we have material aid? Do we have funding? And if we're inside that triangle, we tend to respond, and we run about 18 ops a year.
That's impressive. Some impressive work there. Thank you for sharing. Going on to Erica.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are really good definitions of emergencies. I think, the only thing I would really add is that as emergency food providers, it's really interesting because we've had this, emergency response to providing food in the community for 40 years now that has done nothing but grow. And, we started food banking in the 80s thinking that we were going to be addressing what we saw as an acute emergency for food, and that's not what it turned out to be. So, now we're in this position of always providing an emergency response to something, and I think it's really time that we take a step back from that emergency that's been going on for 40 years and look for the bigger picture answers to that problem.
Definitely agree with that statement. All right, moving on to another question. So in your experience, how have emergencies affected food security How does the type of emergency impact food security? So looking at some of the challenges that have brought about an increase in need for food as assistance. So looking, for instance, at the convoy, a lot of folks weren't able to get in or out. So there was a barrier there. So looking, on all different kind of scales, what are some of these impacts that may not be so obvious to some of us? I mean, a lot of us are working around food security, so we know, those impacts, but some that we might not consider as well. So let's start off with Raul.
Yeah, let me give you some international examples. I'll let the other folks focus on Ottawa, right? So let's look at the volcanic eruption in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, right? The volcano goes off, covers all the farmers' land. You cannot grow anymore. The crops are gone. That's going to impact your ability to import food because you're going to have to import more of it. It affects your economy. It'll affect your exports, means less people have money in order to buy food. Look at the war in Ukraine, right? Do you think there's a steady market? Surprisingly enough, there is. Very early on in the start of that war, when 7 million people were fleeing across a border, the markets were completely disrupted. People really couldn't buy food. So, we would be providing literally ready-made meals like in different villages and cities like Odessa where people are arriving, plus food hampers. Now the market's turned so much that 800 people a day cross from Romania into Ukraine to buy cheaper food items because it's cheaper in Ukraine. It's insanity to think you enter a war zone to buy food. But those are two examples of emergency impacts in the international context.
And thank you for bringing that context. It's really important that we can look at the different levels as well, international, global, local, provincial, looking at how, these types of incidences affect us all in different ways across the world. Christine, would you like to go ahead and add an addition to that?
Just for the local context, we have a large component of rural here, and we have local farmers. And so when we get flooded, or when there's no rain, or when extreme wind event, they're impacted as well. And so that has a big impact on our local economy and for those folks as well. So sometimes I think we tend to forget the large rural component that we have here in Ottawa. And then, there's also that inability, the chain supply, like Rahul had mentioned, when there's impacts outside, it absolutely affects what comes into Canada as well. And so the cost of food goes up, and, that's inevitable. And then, again, more micro is the organization's ability to deliver. So during the convoy, Meals on Wheels weren't able to deliver food, and there was just no access to the folks who were downtown. So there's it goes from micro to macro in terms of how emergencies impact food security.
Agreed. And thank you for making that parallel between the differences. The rural community often, they have additional challenges that often folks in urban or suburban communities don't consider, right, in terms of what that recovery looks like. So thank you for bringing that lens.
Sorry, one more thing. They're animals too, right? Like they have cows, like they're livestock. So if there's anything that happens there, then again, we're impacted. So okay.
Yeah, considering what happened recently in Navan and Cumberland, looking at all that tragedy and all those farms and how that impacted the rural East for sure. Yeah. Erica, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just maybe building a bit on what Christine said, one of the things we always have to look at is how are we keeping the food safe when we're responding in emergency situations. So with the truck convoy, people that we were bringing to bring food to had power, so we could bring in frozen meals that had been pre-made and in like local restaurants that were nutritious. And I'm not talking just like microwave dinner that was purchased at the grocery store. Like we were making and freezing meals and bringing them in for people to reheat. But during the storm in May, it was a very different situation because people were without power. So now you have to get ready to eat meals out to people, and it's much more difficult to keep food in a safe temperature zone to respond in those ways. And one of the things that we learned in that response was that a lot of our community centers don't have the ability to keep food warm or cold for that matter, right? So really making sure that we have the infrastructure in place that we can set up areas, if there's going to be a prolonged power failure, that people can go to their local community center where a generator might be running to keep the power on in the building. But we also need to make sure that there's, warming trays and or walk-in fridges, like those types of things. So.
Excellent points. Yes, that's been, a challenge for a lot of our member agencies, just getting creative, throughout, the pandemic and COVID and all these different, how to best support that, the donations and all things like that. So what do we need to consider to be able to rapidly mobilize to support food insecurity in the event of another emergency? So considering the supply chain issues that we talked about, partnerships, leveraging volunteers, all those additional considerations. So maybe we'll go ahead and start with Christine.
So I would say from an emergency preparedness, through an emergency preparedness lens, I would say to ensure that the supply chain and partners have a continuity of operations plan. I would also say that volunteers, ensure that the volunteers are prepared and resilient as well. And then support that in community by individual and household emergency preparedness. So that's from our perspective at Ottawa Public Health, it's a population health approach. Emergency preparedness is not just it's not just one individual, it's a community of preparedness, and everyone should be involved, right? So if I'm prepared, I can help my neighbor, or if my organization is prepared, to Erica's point, if my organization has a generator, then I can support those meals coming in. To either warm them or cool them or keep them, So I think that's the continuity of operations piece is really important, because I'm also affected by an emergency, right? So if something's happening, I also need to make sure that my family is safe too. So I think that's important.
Yeah, the power of building connections, right? As a system provider level, neighbors, friends, family, doing these emergency preparedness sessions in your home, right?
Like I'm in emergency management, right? So when they call me to respond to an emergency, I have to make sure that my family is taken care of before I can go out. So like that's the thinking. And so it should be that, your volunteers, your organization has to be prepared to respond as well, right? So everybody has to kind of have that thinking.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that to light.
Yeah.
Erica, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think at a really fundamental level, being able to connect with each other is of key import, right? So having phone numbers, like I don't know why these things always happen on the weekends, but it seems to be that, people are not necessarily already naturally together or reachable. So like when the storm happened in May, it happened on a Saturday night, and it was a long weekend. So trying to get a hold of people and find out who is in the city to be able to help with the work, and who has power that they can join into the response to those that don't have power, right? Because a lot of people were dealing with what was happening in their own, circumstances at that time. So, wanting to make sure that at, any number of agencies, the level of connectedness between the agencies are not just a one person to one person contact, because that really slows down the ability to respond. And then I think, see, that's my 2 o'clock alarm. I think then, coming back from there and making sure, that, oh, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. So yeah, those connections are important. And having those partnerships in place beforehand. So if I think about the tornado in 2019, I know that the Parkdale Food Center had lost power and Crackers Catering had lost power, but they had each other's phone numbers. And so they were able to talk to each other and have a neighborhood barbecue, right? So there was all of this food was going to go bad, but Crackers has barbecues and Parkdale had food, and they were able to cook it up and get it out to the community because they were able to connect with each other.
the power of connections, to rely on one another and create those relationships in advance of an emergency, right? So ensuring that we have our ducks in a row in the event that something does happen. Thank you very much. Raul, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, let's just put it in the Ukraine context, right? So sudden onset emergency, a war is declared, women and children are fleeing the country, they're progressively moving west, 16 million people are displaced in the first few days, 6 million cross a border, everyone's overwhelmed. So what we deploy are people and caterers and catering trucks right at the border. So when people make that long, harrowing journey out, they've got a warm meal, whether it's soup or borscht or a sandwich or just even juice, and they've crossed into an area that's safe. Now they got a little bit of food, then they can carry on in their journey, right? So that's an instant response. Well, we move forward into the Ukraine while we're doing that, hire local kitchens, just like we hired caterers in Romania and Moldova. Do the same thing. Attract the local business, keep them going, have them prepare meals. So in Lviv, took over a restaurant in the train station, put tents up. People would be fleeing from the east. They'd get there, they'd arrive at the train station. Look, they have no money, right? They can't access funds. If you think there was a war here, you could go to the ATM. I mean, they shut these things down, right? So at least now they don't have to worry about food while they're trying to think of how am I going to get to the border? Is it a train? Is it a bus, right? But then we have to transition that supply chain to start feeding the families that are going to bunker down and seek refuge there now in the form of food hampers, and they can cook for themselves. A lot more efficient in food delivery, right? Now we got to get people clean drinking water. How do we do that? Point of source unit, point of use unit. We like the point of use units. So all of a sudden you have to be agile, aligned, and adaptable with your supply chains. You have to change to meeting needs. Everything I just described for Ukraine, I can apply to St. Vincent. I can apply to your Ottawa, your convoy, your tornadoes, anything. So it's just always be ready to adapt, always have the right solution in place. Know that whatever you're going to do is not perfect, but just get it going, monitor it, evaluate it, adjust it on the fly, and then just keep it up. And at some point, figure out a way of lowering that cost so you can reach more people.
Thank you so much for that great insight. I love the idea of, identifying, modifying, evaluating, all important things to do before and after. All right, moving on to the next question. We already kind of touched on some of these points, but maybe we can chat about a little bit further. Who needs to be involved in planning and mobilizing for emergencies? So we know, the city and the folks that we talked about in the call here, but who are maybe some of the partners or folks or strategies that we don't necessarily always come to mind, right? Who are our allies during events of emergencies? So we'll go ahead and start with Raul.
Yeah, so let's just go international context. Let's look at the Bahamas or St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Bahamas is a horrible Category 5 hurricane, Dorian, back in 2019. Sits over the island for 16 hours, devastates Grand Bahama and Abacoa. First responders were the citizens themselves, right? And a lot of them belong to civil society organizations, the Pilots Club, Rotary, the Boy Scouts, like all these groups were out. They were out trying to rescue folks, help them get to safety. And then when all of our teams and the rest of the world is coming inbound with supply chain, preposition, aid, biscuits, all kinds of stuff to keep people alive and healthy, those folks know exactly who has the need, what churches are filled with folks, what schools are filled with folks. So to connect with them, bring your supply chain, your resources, your management tools in, the right aid, use those folks to get to the right people. Absolutely no different than what happens in Ottawa. I'm sure you're just going to use different names for the local groups than I did for the Bahamas. Same things with St. Vincent as well. Local government, local churches, just local folks. But it's a matter of how do I move my preposition? How do I now convert and make sure I can open up the market? Market in Bahamas didn't open very quickly. Market in St. Vincent didn't open very quickly. We need to move stuff in because these are island nations, right? So just things to think about, but the locals need to be involved. They know the community.
I agree. It's important to involve locals and get that perspective. Thank you, Raul. Moving on to Erica. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it is very similar in the local context, is that it's really everybody, right? So, and everybody that's able, I guess. So you have those community groups that know the community, and during the power failure in the spring, a lot of people were relying on their neighbors to know who might have a harder time in their neighborhood with a power failure than others, right? So, like I had a friend that brought over all of their freezer contents and put it in my freezer because they needed that freezer space. So, you know, you're connecting on a very personal level in that way. But then there needs to be a level of organization to help do the bigger picture things, right? Like the Ottawa Community Food Partnership purchased 18,000 meals in 10 days during the storm in May, and got them distributed throughout the community. That's a lot of meals, and you don't get to 18,000 without having a whole lot of people helping out with, you know, who can make the meals, where can they go, how are we going to get them there? Like there was, you know, slews of volunteers in every affected community doing that work. And there was a bunch of other organizations that were preparing meals as well, because 18,000 wasn't the number that was needed. It was much higher than that. So I think also, the one thing we did really learn in May, though, was that there wasn't a plan to pay for it. So we had an emergency response. We were asked to just go ahead and do everything, but it took us over 4 months to recover the costs from responding to that emergency. And it still seems a little unclear as to where the money that was finally given to us to pay for the expenses that we were out of pocket for 4 months on, where that money even ended up coming from at the end of the day. So it's just, I think as a community, we need to make sure that as we see more and more of these environmental emergencies coming up, we need to expect that our governments have funds in place to cover the cost of the response to these things.
Thank you. That's a really important point. You know, often these things fall on the backs of organizations or, you know, different groups. And we definitely need leadership from all levels of government when we're dealing with these types of issues. All right, Christine, do you want to go ahead with your take on the question?
Yeah, sure. So to your point, Erica, I think, climate change is real. And we're going to be incurring more and more. Michelle, to your point, we're going to be incurring more and more of these natural disasters or events. And so now's the time to plan and work with other agencies and, just to have these conversations about where do we all fit within the context, like what is our role, and plan long before an emergency happens, right? Because that's the important piece in all of this. My boss has this famous saying, like you can't plan in the middle of an emergency because it's already happening, right? So the who do you reach out to? And, that's a really good question too, but it's like, who responds? It's like regular people, regular people, your neighbor, you're the most important person every time in an emergency. There's, an author, and I'll get her name after, I'll pop it in the chat. But she's a journalist in emergency management, author, and she writes that in every emergency, it's always regular people who are the ones in the local context that helps the neighbor or whatever. It's there's a Vince Davis, who's another author. He touts that schools and community houses they're the ones who are, going to be pulling on all those resources because they know what's going on. To Raul's point, right? It's like all these little, Ottawa's a big place, it's huge, right? So to be able to respond from downtown Ottawa to, all the way out almost to Rockland, that's almost, and what if you can't get there? What if the road's gone? They have to be able to be self-sustained, right? So how do you do that? You just empower people with knowledge and skill and give them the tools to be able to respond on their own. So I think that that's the most important thing, is knowledge and information, and trading on that, right?
Absolutely. The other session right now is on community-based solutions, right? So to your point, we have these leaders, people that are good at, what are you good at? Where do you excel? How can you support people in an event of an emergency? How can you link with your organizations in your city, like, your local food bank, or your connect with your, local MP or city councillor, to have your voice heard, right? So we rely on community members. They're crucial to, community outcomes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to move on. What concrete steps can we take to prepare to mobilize for emergencies? And I realize some of these questions are redundant. We're kind of, kind of going back and forth here, but maybe the less usual answers as well to help guide finish off these preset questions. So what concrete steps can we take to prepare to mobilize for emergencies? So maybe some like high level strategies, some everyday strategies for, the average resident, maybe those different perspectives. So we'll go ahead and start with Erica, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I mean, I think making sure you have contact information for everybody that is around you is a great way to do it. Like, so any other organization like in your neighborhood, or because a lot of power failures, rarely do we see them across the entire city. It's not that it doesn't happen, but a lot of the time it is a very neighborhood specific. So knowing what the assets in your community are and who might have a generator and still have power when you might be out of power, and how to get a hold of those people if it's outside of their regular working hours. And I think just putting a little bit of money away, right? Like all of our agencies have reserves for emergency situations. So ensuring that you've got enough in your reserves to cover the cost of the emergency in the immediate terms while you look for other funding opportunities that might come up afterwards. Like we saw that in the trucker convoy, we immediately started responding to it. And then the United Way came out with funds to cover the cost of that response a couple of weeks later. So, just respond, keep your receipts, and know that there will be groups in the community that will come together with some opportunities to help relieve some of that financial pressure afterwards. Making a plan. I know we can't ever possibly plan for every situation. I have a good friend who does emergency preparedness for a large international company, and it's her job to make sure that they've got a plan for every situation. And of course, after she got hired, the first problem they had was a burst pipe in the parking garage that flooded an entire level of vehicles and nobody could get home. And that was not something that they had planned for, right? So, recognizing that it doesn't matter how much planning we do, there's always going to be something that kind of blindsides us. But if you have a plan, you can look for what's transferable to the current situation.
Thank you so much. Yes, we can't prepare for everything, but I agree. If we have, some key points and key strategies that we can implement in various situations, it often helps people out. All right, Raul, would you like to go next?
Yeah, what's your value add? What's your assets? What do you bring to the table? So in our case, it's all supply chain. Like I've got the food ready to move. I've got the water units ready to move. I've got the generators, the trailers, the rescue equipment, the drones to do aerial imagery and situational awareness. Like what do you have? So as agencies, should you have a generator? Do you have cash? Do you have cash on hand? Because you remember the day that all Interac went out and no one could order from a restaurant? Well, do you have cash to buy? Now, maybe agencies can come in and have some type of agency to agency agreement that would get done in order to buy, but at the very basic level, do you have all the basic things that you need? Now, I will tell you this, and it's going to sound terrible, but unfortunately, our government is very weak at emergency response and emergency management. All three levels can't communicate, and they're always playing catch up on this. Hey, just keep your receipts, go get it done. Agencies have to take all these incredible risks, may not get it back. And then the government comes out and gives us very stupid policies. I'll give you the latest one in Fiona. Hey, we're only going to match the Red Cross to all these agencies responding. So all of a sudden, the 70-year-old retiree in Port aux Basques goes, do I give my $100 to my local food bank? But if I give it to the Red Cross, somehow it'll turn into $200, but it may not come to my community, let alone my province. So the stupidity of interfering with small agencies, and actually tying one arm behind their back and taking money away from them when they need those funds to respond. So there has to be a greater coordination, and we actually have to have government partners that learn how to do the right thing, and that would actually be the greatest concrete step in helping other agencies respond, like a coherent government approach, which we just do not have.
Oh, I agree. I feel like we all need to, hold all levels of government accountable, because our social service, safety net is fraying, and it's often, the municipality or, the organizations that are, upfronting the costs. And, like you said, we don't always know if we're going to get reimbursed, and that often comes later. So excellent points, Raul. I appreciate that insight. Christine.
I would say, so in the chat, I popped for the folks in the in the chat, I popped Emergency Management Ontario's the Be Prepared, just for folks to kind of like get a feel for how organizations can get prepared if they haven't seen it already. But concrete steps could be to think about or get together, like your industry, let's say all food, providers like Erica and community houses, or, get together and say, what is our highest risk? What is the biggest hazard for us? How do we deal with X? What would we do with Z? What is your solution to this problem? Oh, I didn't even know that was a problem. If everybody comes with, one consistent theme of then it kind of bubbles up to the top. Then as a organization, or as a, community houses, you could bring that forward and say, as community houses, we think this, as in the food industry, we need this, and then it's easier to lobby, or it's easier to advocate, or it's easier to bring forward your issues, right? But you have to do the work ahead of time to say, we've met and we know what our hazards are, our risks, we know what our continuity of operations are. Like the work kind of has to get done before you can say, this is what the issues are, these are what our problems are, right? Because yes, you're being asked to support, the response, but we're all part of the response, is I guess what I would say, right? Like everybody's part of the response. Like government's role in this is, save lives, protect property, environment, and there's one more and I'm going to forget now. Sorry, I had it, but that's their role, right? And then everybody else's role is to do the supporting of that, right? Like, so if we know what the ask is, it's easier to make the ask, I guess, is what I've worked in community for a long time, and I know how hard community works. I absolutely see it every day. And so I'm not suggesting that that's not the issue, but I'm saying concrete steps would be having a concrete ask. And it can't just be, I want this because we work hard. It has to be, I want this because of this. And we've done the work, and that's why. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm looking, around advocacy and, holding people accountable, and, mobilizing support with, alongside the community. And at the Ottawa Food Bank with our members, we're trying to, strengthen our collective as a unified voice, right? To look at advocacy, to look at the systems, because these things always existed prior to these types of urgencies. They're just amplified, through these incidences, right? So it's an opportunity for us to really, dig deep and identify that, hey, this is not working. And if now we're even more or less equipped with these new, unprecedented events. So it just
everybody's drinking from a fire hose right now.
That's right.
Like there's no time to breathe, let alone react or think, right? Let alone think, we're just reacting, right? Yeah. So it's like, we just have to help people all the time. Where are we going now? Oh, it's the convoy. No, but we're still during the pandemic. And now there's a big storm. Like there's just no time.
Don't forget about your opioid crisis.
What's that?
Don't forget about your opioid crisis. It's been going on at the same time.
I know. And
Absolutely.
I get you. And so those are the things, like if you had a plan, right? Then it's easier. And I think it would like take all these thoughts out of your head too. At the same time, I think it would be therapeutic almost to like sit down and have someone walk you through, like, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is how we do it, this is what our scope is within this, within the context of this emergency. Because sometimes there's scope creep too, right? Like you go beyond what your means are, because we all want to help, right? That's what we do, we help. But once you do that exercise, then I think it's a lot easier to say, okay, right?
Yeah.
I think anyway. And then the other piece, a concrete piece would be skills, right? Just skills, learning. I love learning. I'm an avid learner. And so when I get the opportunity to actually come and meet people like you guys, I'm so happy to be able to, I've learned a lot today.
That's great. That's great.
So thank you.
No problem. And I appreciate the point, looking at the opioid crisis, the housing crisis, the transportation crisis, these are just compounded issues on top of these urgencies. And often, without that education piece, some people's gut reaction is to say, well, make sure you're stocked up on food and that all these other things that are not applicable to, a lot of folks living in this city. So I think it's important that we understand those other intersectionalities that are impacting folks. It's super important.
And it's concurrent, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right. So now we're on time. Wow, look at that. Amazing. So now we're going to take some questions from the chat. I believe Cassandra is on here. I haven't touched too much because I didn't want to lose anyone. I'm not moving. I think, Alex, excuse me. Alex is here and they're going to go through the chat. And if there's any questions, they're going to read them. And we look forward to your answers. And I'm still here if you need me.
Yeah, so an open invitation for anyone to ask a question into the chat. We've heard from a few people that perhaps the chat function is disabled, so we're just looking into that right now. But please feel free, or if you want to raise a hand perhaps to participate, just let us know.
While we're waiting for that, I can throw in one point that might be of interest for you. So because it's a food security, chat that we're talking about, all your groups have been out there publicly explaining that you've had a record increase of client visits, right? Food security across this country is an issue. There's more people coming to food banks, okay? And we think that's because of the pandemic, now this financial crisis that we're entering into, add in affordability issues and hyperinflation. Do you want to know what it's like internationally? This year, we're on track for 270 million people in acute need of humanitarian assistance. A decade ago, 2012, it was 62 million. So we're on pace for a 400% growth over the decade. The only way you want to see 400% growth over your decade is in your retirement fund, not in people in need. And the money to keep up and meet that need, it hasn't grown at the same level. It's not going up. So you've got this increased need and a flattening out, widening gap. So it's interesting because internationally, we have a much harder time now meeting those needs, right? Things cost more people need our help, there's less money available. We really need to innovate to drive down costs. And I would also say that in our domestic programming, we've actually run programs designed with that same innovative idea where we buy like 100-pound bags of rice in bulk, millions of pounds of bags. We have volunteers, high school kids to the elderly, to retirees coming in and repacking them in nice looking bags and then putting them out to food banks across the country. Because for every dollar invested in our program, we're yielding about $4 retail worth of food. So food banks couldn't even buy this stuff as cheap as we can produce it. So it's ideas and innovations like that that actually will resolve will help us get to the other side with these increased demands.
Yeah. Michelle, I don't think anybody has any questions for us.
Well, actually, we have a question for you. This is formulated by our team. How do we move away from drinking from a fire hose? Who needs to be leading this shift?
Well, I was in a session this morning and it was Katie. I think it was Katie. And She had some really great points. She said, you know, just skills. You know, she was mentioning, so it's going to be a process, obviously, and it's not going to happen overnight. But I really agreed with what she was saying, which was provide people with skills that attend that actually come to the food bank and or that are clients. So and then put those wraparound supports, maybe even within so that's a population health approach. That's social determinants of health. The folks that are coming, they you know, to meet them where they're at, I think is really important, right? And have those really respectful conversations in a space where they feel safe, they feel heard, and you know, have. I used to work for and volunteer for the Distress Center of Ottawa and Region. And so to listen twice as much as you speak, I feel like that's really super important. They will provide you, like she said, with the answers that are needed. Sometimes I think we pontificate, we as a community pontificate about what other people need. But I love talking to folks about what it is that they actually, you know, what is it that will make it better? How can we help? Or not even how can we help? Because that's a triggering question too, but just to sit and listen, have a conversation, because once they feel safe enough to talk, and that even sometimes I don't even feel safe to talk to people because I never, you know, depends on who's listening to me. When the stories start to flow, then you start to get the answers, right?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this one too. I think that, you know, if we're looking at the emergency of, you know, that we've been responding to since 1980 with emergency food provision, that's not getting anywhere. I think what we need to, like, those wraparound services absolutely are needed, and those other things that Christine was just mentioning, but also people need an income, right? We are, you know, poverty causes hunger, like it causes homelessness and hunger. So our social assistance rates haven't risen in, you know, what, 2 decades now, and at that point they went backwards. So like nothing is actually, like, people don't receive enough support to live. We know that. So we need to, you know, lobby the government. And then I think the other thing is, Roel made an amazing point earlier that we need to tell the government levels to work with each other and to talk to each other and to talk to the agencies on the ground, as well as some of the larger funding organizations, right? Like, you know, we can't continue to just say it's okay for them not to talk to each other. And if the policies that they're putting in place are detrimental to the emergency response, they need to hear that and they need to adjust. So I think that, you know, if we want to stop drinking out of a fire hose, we need to actually expect that there are some real changes in how we are governed.
Yeah. But also how we are governed, but how we behave within the governance structure, right? Because it's all about behavior, right? And it is our behavior too. I'm a citizen too, like I'm a resident. And so I just feel like we need to also, it's not necessarily how we're funded, but that is a great point. But Katie's point this morning was providing people with skills so that they can get a living wage job, which I felt was actually, I was speaking to Rick Watson of the Mission, and I said, Rick, you know, sometimes like we have recipes on Ottawa Public Health's website on how to boil an egg. Is that even true? Is that a reality? He said, Christine, he said, some people don't even know how to turn on the stove. So right. It would be great if we could just teach people those basic skills.
But also not just the skills to get a living wage job. We need to have the policies in place that all jobs give living wages, right? We need to close the loopholes that allow people to have part-time jobs so they don't receive benefits and end up having to work multiple jobs at the same time in order to try to, you know, have an income that's sufficient when, you know, a full-time minimum wage job isn't going to ever be sufficient income at the rate it's at right now.
Can I jump in real quick, Michelle? So two quick points. One, for your institutions, I think structurally you need to change. You need to realize that the emergencies are more often, they're much more impactful, they're much more devastating, the volumes are way up, and you're always going to be drinking from a fire hose. So it just means you have to put more resources into that so that there's more people to receive from that fire hose. And then you just have to break away some of your structures to understand that this is your emergency response and then build up the others. Increasing universal basic income or some of these other supports is a fantastic idea, but there's also one drawback that we all have to think about, and that's the value of the money that we provide. So in a place like Toronto, I'm sure it's happened in Ottawa, a charity that pays rent in 2012 in an industrial space, that rent has tripled today. So if we're still giving that charity the same amount of money, the value of that money is 33%. So even if we increase rates of what we give people, their buying power in stores is not really that good when you have a food inflation rate of 11%. So in order to counter that, you need models like the ones we're running to affect supply chain and drive costs down. And I'm not saying this is the only solution, but you need a complementarity of approaches, or going with just one thing, it's not going to work and people are not going to get the help that they need.
Thank you so much, Raul. That's great to finish us off on that note. I'm hearing, you know, we need to hold the institutions accountable, and we need to empower folks, and we need to come up with a plan, and we need to lean in on our neighbors and other service providers to leverage the work. All right, so now we're going to go into a breakout sessions. We'll have about, supposed to be 10 minutes, so maybe like 8 and a little bit, just to kind of report back some, you know, top takeaways. What do you plan on? How can you use this knowledge in your work? So what are your top 3 takeaways and how can you use this in your work? You can go ahead and just put that in the chat, and we'll come back after 10 minutes and just have a little little check-in, a little chat, so people can kind of go over some of the responses. So nothing too formal. So IT folks, if you can go ahead and put us in breakout rooms. I'm going to do the genie thing.
Michelle, I got a jet because I got my 2:30. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Raul. We appreciate it so much. We'll be in touch. Thank you. All right. I'm not going to go in a breakout room, but I hope to see all of you back here in a little bit. So I don't know how many groups there were in the end, but I don't know if there are any participants who would like to maybe bring back to the larger group some of the emerging ideas, thoughts, some stuff that you're going to apply to your work, some new discoveries. Just please put up your hand and not all at once, everyone. Okay, so I guess there's something going on with the chat. If there's any questions there. I don't know if Alex is here.
It looked like there was one hand up.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I think it was Madison, maybe? Sure,
go ahead, Madison, if it's Madison. I can't see on my end here. I was been told to ask ELC to unmute people so they can speak. That would be helpful.
Yeah, I just did.
Okay, great. So whoever had their hand up, please go ahead.
Madison was having a hard time. We were in the chat together and she was having a hard time with her mic.
Okay. We'll wait for Madison maybe to get settled there. Is there anyone else while we're kind of waiting? I can go for myself. I think, one of the big takeaways was, it's important that we look at what's happening on a global level, just look at some of the similarities, right? And how what constitute an emergency to someone might not be an emergency to someone else, right? So having that lens, being well connected to the community to understand, like we talked about, the strengths, needs, challenges, to understand how some folks are experiencing things. So just having those larger perspectives and tailoring them as we see fit. I think that was really helpful. Okay, so I've been, some things are popping up here. So maybe ask the panelists for their takeaways from the breakouts. So maybe we can do that. Put the pressure on the panelists. They're used to this. So Christine, I don't know. I see you're unmuted there. Why don't you start?
Well, I didn't have a chance to talk to the folks in my breakout room,
Okay.
but I can bring back what I got from the session, which is, what, like you said, what constitutes an emergency for someone, doesn't necessarily make it an emergency for another, but I'll put a different spin on it. Those with means, an emergency can sometimes mean an inconvenience, right? Just a minor inconvenience. So like a 3 to 5 day power outage for some, it's like, oh, well, this doesn't work, or, I have to go get the generator and get some gas and that kind of thing, right? But for others who are already in a crisis, whether it's financial, mental health crisis, or whatever the case may be, you have just exacerbated, like the crisis has just, or disaster has just exacerbated that situation.
Yeah.
And so someone who was already in crisis, they are now in a full-blown crisis.
That's right.
And food is always like the last thing, right? When you're at a food bank, it's always, or if you're food insecure, it's the last thing to go, right? Like, and so I think there's a lot of work that needs to happen before we get to a food bank. And so, and someone said that to me, last week. I think it was like a minor inconvenience. And I was almost like, the privilege in that statement was just, it felt just wrong. Right. So I think there's a lot of work with the wraparound supports and everything else that comes before that we really need to work on. And I applaud everyone in this chat for all the work that they do. I think it's important, and I'm grateful for everything that you guys do.
Yes, I agree. I mean, these inequities have always existed, and part of the emergency response, the way I see it, is also doing that work of lobbying, right, to the government, and lobbying about an affordable wage, basic living wage, affordable housing. That is also emergency preparedness, right? And keeping, cultural values and norms and uplifting communities, and all of that is creating healthy and well-being in neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So thank you for that context.
Mm-hmm.
Erica, do you have any takeaways from your group that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, what we talked about mostly was ensuring that the emergency responses include food, right? That it's, as we see more storms, as we're going to see more blackouts, that, organizations like the Red Cross and governments, when they are looking at what their responses to these situations are, we need to make sure that food is in the plan right from the beginning, and not just, a leftover, right? Like you don't want to be living off sandwiches for an extended period of time, because that's all that is available, right? We need to make sure that we are nurturing people and giving people real food that is healthy, and food that everybody can eat, right? Like, so that means having a variety of things available, but recognizing that people still need to have nourishment during emergencies.